A science story, huh?
These NYU scientists,
I felt
on this.
right.
But I was so
And I just thought, well,
I had figured it out
it was that golden moment.
because science was on my side.
Hey everyone. Welcome to The Story Collider, where true personal stories about science help us to discover how weird and wonderful it is to exist in this world and be a human. I'm your host, Michaela Agapiou, and today's episode is all about the power of friendship. I'm so excited for this heartwarming episode because it's such a great reminder that our pals can be our lifelines, our cheerleaders, our ride or dies, or even personal superheroes. Friends make everything better, even sucky science experiments, like in our first story from Michaela Agapiou, where her lab mates totally come to the rescue. Michaela is a research scientist and storyteller from London, and also one of our Story Collider producers. Her story is recorded at Imperial College London at one of their Spark After Dark events, and is a great reminder for all of us socially anxious people that even if you'd rather die than ask for help, it's usually not that bad, and the result is always way better than if you tried to do it all on your own. Here's Michaela.
So my least favourite lab experiment in my undergraduate when I was doing biochem way back in 2012 was when we had to sort out male and female fruit flies and work out like how many had red eyes or white eyes or one type of wing or another type of wing. And it was so boring. I hated it because I was rubbish at it. And also, I really hate being that person, but I was like, when am I ever going to need to know how to do this? I wanted to be a molecular biologist. I wanted to know how they had red eyes or white eyes, not observe and count how many do. Lo and behold, 4 years later, I signed myself up to do a PhD at the University of Leeds, where I'd be studying how a protein has a role in sperm cell development in fruit flies. But it was still firmly going to be a molecular biology PhD. I was studying not just this protein, but one form of this protein that existed in about 8 to 10 cells of the fruit fly testis. So really nice and particular and niche. And for this project, I was going to be split between two different lab spaces. The first was a standard molecular biology lab with lab coats and gloves, pipettes, PCR machines, endless jars of colourless liquids. This was the equivalent of my work safe space. I felt comfortable here, I felt familiar here, I felt confident and excited. I decided when I was 15 I wanted to be a scientist, and all my training had been leading up to me doing this project in this lab space. The other lab was the fly lab, and that was way less familiar. At every workstation, there's a microscope, there's a jar with paintbrushes, dissecting tools, and pens. And there's also these really gross flasks of ethanol where all the discarded flies get thrown into. It's super gross. And we also didn't have to wear gloves in there, which was super weird. How can there be a lab without gloves? But this lab space was my co-supervisor, Amanda's, and her fly team helped get me set up and started and showed me the ropes of looking after flies. They were interested in fly mating experiments and told me their little tricks. Like, we store the flies in these plastic vials with their food at the bottom, which is normally smooth. But if you scratch a little bit into the top of it, it encourages the flies to lay eggs there, so you get more flies. Excellent. Pretty quickly into my PhD, I realized I was actually going to be spending more time in the fly lab than I was in the molecular lab, because flies are really, really small, particularly fruit flies. And I had to dissect so many flies to be able to get enough sample to even do anything in the molecular lab. So I had this kind of FOMO of missing out with things in the main molecular lab. I particularly missed Katerina, who was a PhD student who started at the same time as me in my main group. And we kind of had each other to muddle through all the new things we were figuring out. Whereas in the fly lab, Amanda's team, they'd already been there for at least a year or so before me. Some of them had been there for 3 years, and they all seemed super competent, but also like really close. And they just had like a bond that I just didn't feel like I was a part of. And I kind of expected that at the beginning, but I didn't really feel like I was progressing. And if you came into the fly lab at any given time, it would kind of look like I was doing the same kind of thing as Amanda's team. We'd be there sorting flies, counting flies. I could now tell the difference between male and female flies, combining different genetically modified flies together. But actually, our interests were really different, and the type of experiments we did were really different. So I kind of felt a bit different and a bit of an outsider there. But like the other thing was I was also trying to hide the things I was worried about, like not being able to do from them, because I was used to being the competent, confident lab person, and here that was not happening. I think it took 4 months until one day I looked down the microscope, and instead of the 2 overlapping fields of view I'd been seeing, it was finally one circle, like it had supposed to have been the whole time. And I was just like, oh my God, this is going to make my life so much easier. But also, why has it taken so long for me to be able to do this? This is ridiculous. And why can't I pooter? Pootering is when you have this long plastic tube and you suck up a fly into the tube. But it's a long tube for a reason. You're not going to eat the fly, don't worry. And then you move the tube into a new vial and blow out the tube and put the fly in there. Sounds pretty simple. You just like suck up and then you blow it out. It's all fine. But I could not get the hang of it at all. And I found it like a really awkward, embarrassing thing to practice in the lab, just like blowing it out of this tube, and it's like plastic and feels gross, and you get like a bit of the like kind of taste. I think I can taste like the yeast food that they eat, and like it's gross. And like I don't know if that's in my head or not, but and yeah, so I just stop trying to practice that. It's also stressful because you're trying to not release genetically modified flies out into the wild. So yeah, I stopped doing that, and I just use CO2, which is another way you can knock out a fly, and then they're much more easier to move about. And I could get away with this. I could hide this because the real fly people, they use CO2 as well, but they cared for their fly mating experiments about, the whole fly and being gentle to the fly. So in those cases, they had to pooter, whereas I was just going to dissect and tear up my fly anyway, so I can just use the CO2, right? Now, while I was there just caring about my protein and not really caring about fly mating, Amanda, my supervisor, didn't really get why I just cared about this protein when I didn't know what was going on with the mating. And she would kind of bring this up in my monthly supervised meetings every now and then. It was kind of annoying, especially when I had this fun list of like all these other experiments to do. So for a solid year, I managed to avoid doing any behavioral experiments. But eventually she wore us down and got us to agree that I should do something called a sperm competition assay. And I came away from that meeting a bit annoyed about all the sad, fun experiments I'd have to delay. I came with a list of papers, a respect for Amanda's persistence of a year getting me to do this experiment, and this kind of little bit of fear that I just like wasn't enough of a fly person to kind of do this experiment well. And I had a trip down to London to visit my family that weekend, and I took the papers with me. Trains are a great place to read papers. And thankfully the word sperm competition encouraged the man in the seat next to me to move. So I had 2 hours with 2 seats to myself, which is ideal. I got cozy and started reading the papers, and it was surprisingly interesting. It turns out a lot of insects, including fruit flies, when they mate twice, they're more likely to have offspring from the second mating than the first, which was counterintuitive to me, and a fun fact I didn't know. And through this competition experiment, you could learn about sperm offense and sperm defense properties of a fly, which, despite having studied sperm cells for last year, were not terms I'd ever heard of. So I kind of got into the idea of doing this experiment and came up with a plan. And it takes a month or so to actually grow the flies, get everything ready. And I do that, and it's experiment day, and I'm kind of excited. I get into the fly room, which is 25 degrees Celsius and 50% humidity, which sounds like an ideal climate for me, but it's also really smelly because of said yeast. And I have to set up 160 pairs of flies as quickly as possible. And I'm really regretting that I never learned how to pooter last year. Instead, I'm using my favorite red paintbrush and trying to pick up the flies and transfer them to a vial as quickly as possible without them flying away or squashing them. And I end up squashing quite a few. And I'm very annoyed at myself because more flies are dying than necessary. And while I have dissected tens of thousands of flies for my PhD, I do still care about trying to minimize the death. And I'm also annoyed at myself because I just let this embarrassment stop me from learning a thing, especially when I was new. No one would have cared, I now realize. But now 12 months in, I really look like an idiot that I can't do this thing. So the embarrassment is 10 times worse. I get on with the experiment for the next day or so. And at the end of the 2 days, I have half as much data as I wanted, partly from the squishing, but also because one of my genetically modified flies is not very attractive, it turns out, which is interesting, but not what I had accounted for. They all look the same to me. And so I sit down with Amanda and I'm like, oh, I'm annoyed. I actually care about this experiment. You got me excited about this experiment. This is your fault. No. And we sit down, run the numbers, and I need to scale up to 800 pairs to get enough data in one day. And this means I'm going to need help. And what that really means for me is that I have to tell the fly team that I can't pooter. So another couple of months of prep, and experiment day rolls around once again, and I've got my spare set of clothes, because they're going to smell at the end of this. I have my vase and vase and vase of flies. I have Amanda and her trio, all with a pooter around their neck. And then I've got my favorite silly red paintbrush. And I go through the layout for the day, what vase we're responsible for, and I kind of skim over the I can't pooter and I'm going to use this paintbrush thing. And then Lauren, another PhD student, goes, whoa, Michaela, you can't pooter? And I'm like, no, but I got my paintbrush, it's all good. And she's like, well, we'll just do the pootering, don't worry about it. And I'm like, no, it's my stupid experiments and my stupid flies that won't mate. I've got to do my bit. You're all helping me out and I really appreciate it. And she's like, no, Michaela, it'll be much faster if we pooter. It really doesn't matter. Just keep giving us the vase of flies and get everything set up. And all that embarrassment and shame I'd been holding on to, well, maybe not all of it, but most of it gets replaced by relief and real gratitude for her true lack of judgment. And then there's a little bit of shame that's ashamed that I was ashamed, but anyways. We have a frantic half an hour or so, which is about as long as it took me to do the 160 on my own, and now we do 800 together. Passing around vials, getting everything set up, all in sync and chaos in this tiny little smelly room. And everything's ready, and we're all facing this wall where there's all these vials and vials of flies, each in their individual little pairs, and we're scanning them to see if any of them are mating. Ready with our pens to tick them off if they are. And Amanda just goes, so, what's the latest gossip? And I know I'm part of the team. Thanks.
That was Michaela. To find out more about her, visit our website, storyclatter.org. Being a storyteller on stage is just one way to make story clutter happen, but if standing alone in the spotlight in front of an audience doesn't speak to you, maybe becoming a story clutter donor might be more your speed. Story clutter donors play a vital role in our ability to bring you this podcast. We're in this together. Story clutter is one big experiment that's designed to connect us around our love of discovery, curiosity, and the natural world. If you believe in the power these stories have and this mission, please donate to the Story Clutter at storyclatter.org/donate. The most popular level is $10 a month, and you can make your tax-deductible donation at storyclatter.org/donate. But really, any level makes a difference, and we're so grateful to everyone who supports Storyclatter.
Rusty Clark, an Army and Air Force veteran, needed treatment at a VA hospital. Meet his wife, Juanita.
We live above Morgantown, West Virginia. It would take us about 7 hours to get here. And I was prepared to sleep on the hospital floor beside of Mr. Clark. But the Fisher House opened up that door. We had a lovely suite to stay in. We had food to eat. We didn't have to worry about that because the Fisher House, the foundation, Mr. and Mrs. Fisher took care of all that years ago, following their dream to make our reality that we were together and we could be treated here. It's a great blessing.
Meet Rusty.
I was in the Army Guard, and then I went into the Air Force, and then I met Juanita.
Keeping families together when they need it most. For active duty military wounded and veterans sick or injured, Fisher Houses make a huge difference. Learn more at fisherhouse.org. That's fisherhouse.org.
Because the family's love
Is good medicine.
Our next story is from storyteller Ashley McKelvy. Ashley is a storyteller living in Georgia, and her story really hits home for all of us overachievers out there. Her story is recorded at our go-to spot in Atlanta, Waller's Coffee Shop, and it has all the elements of an epic science story, including a wild experiment involving way too much caffeine, and a ragtag team of friends willing to risk it all in the name of curiosity. This story will have you laughing out loud the whole way through, and you're gonna love it. Here's Ashley.
So, freshman year of college, I am sitting in my honors biology classroom with a huge case of imposter syndrome because I was a pretty good student generally in high school, but I had a very colorful science education background. One of my professors was known for telling a group of students one time that he owned a pair of anti-gravity boots and that he had once startled a janitor after classes because he was levitating in the classroom. And the students were like, "Really? So can we see?" And he said, "Oh, no." And he immediately just points to the window. He's like, "It's raining outside. My ankles are swollen. They won't fit." And that could have just been like a weird thing he said, but like he just wouldn't back down from things like that. He once told a story about an experiment he had done on the weekend, and it had gone wrong somehow, and he was shooting fireballs down the hallway, and we were just like, I mean, I think that my science background is like basically riddled with science fiction. And so I always felt like a little nervous about like my ability in a science classroom. So I'm sitting in this biology class and I'm like, I'm not 100% sure whether or not a man can levitate, but like, I know that I don't belong in this classroom. And so I'm ready for this class to be kind of a struggle. And it turns out it's going to be a struggle for everybody. For some reason, I have been a teacher since the time that I was in this classroom, and I think that the professor just had a hard time kind of figuring out where we were at academically. And so she came at us with like some really intense, hardcore science for the first couple of weeks. And I was just like, well, obviously I don't know what's going on because I'm very bad at this. But then I was talking to other people and they were like, no, none of us know what is happening right now. And so she must have figured out that she was like way over our heads. So she decided to dial it back down. And we came in one day and she had a hands-on activity meant to guide us through the scientific method. And I was like, okay, I know I'm bad at this, but like I was a latchkey kid with access to Nickelodeon. So I watched a lot of Mr. Wizard when I was growing up. Like I was taught science by a nice man who did science experiments with neighborhood kids in his kitchen on TV for me. Like I've met the scientific method. I'm not here. And so I start to panic because if I don't know what is expected of me, then I don't know how to get good grades. And getting good grades is basically my whole identity at that time in my life. And not only that, but I'm in college on a pretty big scholarship and I don't want to screw that up. So I know that I need to do something. And for this class, we have to write a paper. And I feel pretty confident in my ability to write a paper, but I need something more. And so I decide that I'm going to design my own experiment. I was writing a paper about caffeine, and at the time, there were two facts that stuck out to me in my research. One was that a 6-ounce cup of coffee contains about 100 milligrams of caffeine. And two was that it takes about 20 minutes for your system to fully metabolize caffeine. So I decide to get a bunch of my friends together. I get 10 friends who agree to come to my dorm room on a Saturday afternoon, and we are going to drink a 6-ounce cup of coffee every 20 minutes for 2 hours. And I've decided to make it scientific. So like every 20 minutes, we write down how we're feeling and we sign our names, because I thought maybe our signatures would change as we got more caffeinated. I don't know. And so we all do it. We get together in my tiny little cinder block dorm room. We got 2 pots of coffee going. We've got some 6-ounce cups of coffee. And we just proceed to drink coffee every 20 minutes. And the first hour is fine because we're college kids and it's coffee. So like we're used to this sort of thing. It's not a big deal. But after the 4th cup, my friend Paul came to me and he just said, I have to stop. I have to stop, because if I keep doing this, I'm going to get very angry. And I was like, okay, like you're not, yeah. Thank you for your service. Like fill out your questionnaire and, no problem. You're free to go. And so he left. And the rest of us persisted. So we drank the 5th cup of coffee, and it starts to like not taste good anymore. And it starts to feel really like kind of acidic in your stomach. And then we drink our 6th cup of coffee, and we fill out our papers and sign our names. And then we immediately, everybody just like runs out of my dorm room where we've been sitting for 2 hours to like do whatever they feel instinctively they need to do to take care of their body. And so a bunch of people immediately go outside and start smoking. I go outside and join the smokers, not because I'm a smoker, but because I need to talk at people really fast and probably too loud for like a long time. And so I'm like pacing back and forth until like I kind of where the edge wears off a little bit, and I start to like calm down enough that I decide to go up to the 2nd floor of my dorm and check on my friend Mo. And Mo is like laying flat in bed with the lights off, and she said, I've ordered pizza. I have to eat. I feel terrible. And I was like, yeah, I feel pretty bad too. And I was like, food actually sounds like a good idea. I ate some food. I absorbed the coffee a little bit, and we're all like, teenagers basically. So after a couple of bad hours, we all get a good night's sleep and we're fine the next day. And I write my paper and I hand it in. And 2 weeks later, my professor is handing papers back out, and she said, hey, I left your paper in my office. Can you come to my office hours and get it? And I said, sure, yeah, no problem. I was feeling pretty confident that I had done enough to show initiative and stand out, that I did not think I could possibly be in trouble. And so I went to office hours, and she sat me down and she said, just so you know, when you do experiments on human beings, there is a process. You have to like submit it for review, and people have to examine it for like ethical, implications and sign off on it. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And it was a little sheepish because like we obviously both knew I did not do that. But then she handed me my paper, and I sort of did the mental math. I'm very good at math. And I did the mental math and was like, okay, I'm going to make a B in this class. That is going to be fine. I'm going to happily take it. I'm going to take intro to geology and satisfy my science requirements, and I am moving on. But it's kind of funny, the things that you learn in college. There's the academic things you learn. There are the interesting facts you learn along the way about like, ethical reporting in science experiments. And then there's these other things that you learn. And what I learned from doing that experiment is basically nothing about coffee. What I learned is that I had 10 friends who were willing to low-level poison themselves just because I asked, and because they cared about me and they wanted to help me out. Thanks.
That was Ashley. If you'd like to learn more about her, visit our website, storyclatter.org. Our website is just one way to connect with us, but there are so many other ways, and we hope you'll use them all. You can always follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Head to storyclatter.org to become a financial supporter, or if you want to come to one of our shows, start your own Storyclatter show in your community, or even learn how to tell your own story about science. You can learn all about that on our website, too. This podcast is produced by me, Misha Gajewski, along with Jen Chen and Aaron Barker, Executive Director and Co-founder of the Storyclatter. The stories featured in today's episode were produced by Richard Kemeny, Emma Yarbrough, and Kelly Vinyl. Special thanks goes out to Storyclatter's board and staff, including Anne-Marie Lonsdale, Leslie Bernson, and Lindsay Cooper. Our theme music is by Ghost, and next week I'll be back with stories about identity crises. They're amazing stories, and you won't want to miss them. Until next time, thanks so much for listening.